The Texas sun beats down on a cracked, dusty road in the middle of nowhere, baking the earth until the air shimmers and smells like scorched clay and dried mesquite. That same relentless dust seems to cling to the memory of a man standing in a place where he is suddenly made to feel he does not belong. The focus pulls tightly to a pair of vintage ostrich leather boots, meticulously polished, but bearing the undeniable deep creases of years of hard, honest labor. These boots step hesitantly onto the thick plush carpet of a sprawling lobby, bathed in the blinding golden light of imported crystal chandeliers. The contrast is immediate and utterly brutal. It is the proud rustic soul of the working class colliding head-on with the sterile freezing coldness of newly imported elitist luxury. We see the large calloused hands of a man trembling ever so slightly as they grip a bouquet of red roses, their petals slightly wilted from the suffocating heat of the Dallas asphalt outside. He and his wife, wearing her absolute best floral Sunday dress, are abruptly blocked by a maitre d' in a razor-sharp tailored Italian suit who looks down his nose at them with undisguised, visceral disgust. The humiliation hangs thick in the chilled air, suffocating and heavy. But the real shock, the moment that will shift the axis of this entire evening, happens when the delicate ambient sound of silver cutlery clinking against fine porcelain abruptly ceases in the background of the grand dining room. A tall, imposing figure wearing a pristine black resistal hat and an impeccably cut dark blazer rises slowly from a secluded, dimly lit corner table. The silence that follows is not one of mere expectation. It is a heavy, breathless silence of absolute reverence. The king of country has just witnessed an unforgivable injustice, and the suited elite of this establishment are about to learn a devastating, unforgettable lesson about the true weight of the word class. To understand the crushing weight of this moment, one must understand the long, grueling road that led Caleb and Sarah to the glass doors of the Oak and Iron Reserve. Caleb is a man forged by the unforgiving elements of the Texas landscape. He is a ranch foreman, a man who spends 10 to 12 hours a day under a merciless sun that routinely pushes past 100 degrees. His face is deeply tanned and lined with the kind of premature weathering that only comes from staring down dust storms and squinting into the glaring horizon while mending miles of barbed wire fences. His hands are thick, rough like coarse sandpaper, scarred from rogue nails and unpredictable stallions, but they are hands that have only ever touched his wife with the utmost profound gentleness. He is a man of few words, but deep convictions anchored by a quiet, unwavering faith and a belief that a hard day's work is the ultimate measure of a man's worth. Sarah is his anchor, his sanctuary in a world of dust and sweat. She works at a small weathered roadside diner on the outskirts of their rural county. For 10 years, she has poured black coffee for weary truckers, wiped down sticky vinyl booths with bleach that dried out her hands, and smiled through the bone-deep exhaustion of double shifts. She smells faintly of vanilla and fried food, a scent Caleb finds more comforting than any expensive perfume. Together, they have built a life that is rich in love, but constantly strained by the harsh realities of living paycheck to paycheck. When the engine of their only truck blew a gasket, they ate beans and rice for a month. When the winter freeze burst their pipes, they huddled under a single quilt and thanked God they at least had each other to keep warm. This year marked their 10th wedding anniversary, a decade of surviving storms both literal and metaphorical. Caleb had made a silent vow to himself 12 months ago that he was going to give Sarah one night of absolute, unadulterated magic. One night where she did not have to look at a price tag, where she did not have to serve anyone else, where she could feel like the queen she was in his eyes. He heard about the Oak and Iron Reserve from the wealthy owner of the ranch where he worked. It was known as the most exclusive 5-star steakhouse in Dallas, a place where reservations were booked 6 months in advance, and the beef was flown in from private global estates. For an entire year, Caleb and Sarah kept a large glass mason jar on their battered kitchen table. Every single tip Sarah brought home from the diner, every dollar of overtime Caleb earned breaking wild horses, went into that jar. They sacrificed simple pleasures. They skipped the local county fair, they patched up worn-out jeans instead of buying new ones, and they ignored the creeping dampness in their roof. The jar was their beacon of hope, a tangible manifestation of their enduring romance. When the day finally arrived, They counted the crumpled bills and heavy coins with tears in their eyes. They had done it. They had enough for the tasting menu, the expensive wine, and the valet parking. The preparation for the evening was a ritual of profound respect. Caleb carefully took out his best suit, a sturdy navy twill that he had worn to weddings and funerals alike. It was clean and pressed, though the cut was undoubtedly out of fashion. But the most important items he wore were his accessories. He slid his feet into the ostrich leather cowboy boots that his late father had given him on his 18th birthday. His father had told him that a good pair of boots carries a man through his hardest days and keeps him grounded when he reaches the top. Around his neck, he fastened a braided leather bolo tie secured by a magnificent piece of polished turquoise set in silver. It was a piece of authentic local craftsmanship, a symbol of his heritage and his pride. Sarah wore a simple but beautiful floral dress she had found on sale. She spent an hour curling her hair and applying the little makeup she owned. When Caleb looked at her standing in their cramped hallway, he felt his breath catch in his throat. He told her she was the most beautiful woman in the whole state of Texas, and he meant it from the bottom of his soul. The drive to Dallas took 2 hours in their rattling pickup truck. The transition from the wide-open plains, where the sky stretched out in a canvas of bruised purple and fiery orange, into the towering concrete canyons of the city, was overwhelming. The skyscrapers cast long, cold shadows over the streets, and the sheer volume of luxury cars made Caleb grip the steering wheel a little tighter. They pulled up to the grand entrance of the Oak and Iron Reserve, feeling a sudden wave of intimidation. The building was a monolith of dark wood frosted glass and polished brass. A valet in a uniform that looked more expensive than Caleb's entire wardrobe approached the truck. The valet masked a smirk as he handed Caleb a ticket, gingerly taking the keys to the dusty vehicle, as if it might infect him. Caleb swallowed his pride, helped Sarah out of the passenger side, and offered her his arm. They walked through the heavy oak doors and were immediately hit by a wall of freezing air conditioning. The interior was a sensory overload of wealth. The air smelled of expensive oud wood cologne, roasted garlic and white truffles. Soft, ambient jazz floated through the room, masking the hushed conversations of politicians, corporate executives, and socialites. The lighting was dim and moody, designed to make the diamonds on the women's necks sparkle like captured stars. It was a place that had originally been founded decades ago by wealthy cattle barons celebrating the rustic roots of the state, but it had recently been purchased by a massive New York hospitality conglomerate. The new owners had systematically stripped away the warm southern hospitality, replacing it with an icy, snobbish atmosphere, an intimidating European dress code, and a staff trained to gatekeep the elite from the ordinary. At the front desk, standing behind a sleek podium of black marble, was Julian, the newly appointed maitre d'. Julian was a man who prided himself on his ability to curate the visual aesthetic of the dining room. He wore a slim, fitting charcoal suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, his eyes constantly scanning the room for imperfections. When he saw Caleb and Sarah approaching, his posture stiffened. His eyes darted from Caleb's vintage boots to the turquoise bolo tie, and finally to Sarah's modest floral dress. To Julian, they were an absolute eyesore, a disruption to the meticulously crafted illusion of exclusivity he was hired to maintain. Caleb stepped up to the podium, offering a warm, polite smile, the kind of smile that in his world meant you were among friends. "Good evening, Sir Caleb," said his deep voice carrying the unmistakable drawl of the countryside. "We have a reservation under the name Caleb Hayes. It's our 10th anniversary." Julian did not return the smile. He did not even look at the silver clipboard in front of him. Instead, he let his gaze travel slowly up and down Caleb's frame, a deliberate and calculated gesture designed to make Caleb feel small. He sighed a soft, condescending sound that cut through Caleb worse than a physical blow. "I'm afraid there must be some sort of misunderstanding," Sir Julian said, his voice dripping with faux politeness, projected just loudly enough so the wealthy patrons sipping martinis at the nearby bar could hear. "We enforce a very strict European dress code here at the reserve. We require jackets and traditional ties for gentlemen and elegant evening wear for ladies. We do not permit rustic work attire or costume pieces." Caleb's smile faltered, but he maintained his composure, tightening his grip on the wilting red roses. "I understand you have rules," Sir Caleb replied, keeping his voice low and respectful. but this is my best suit. And this tie, well, it's a traditional bolo, it's formal wear where I come from. We saved up for a whole year to be here tonight. We just want to have a quiet dinner." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, a sound that echoed cruelly in the marble lobby. "Where you come from, perhaps," he sneered, leaning slightly over the podium. "But this is Dallas, and this is a five-star establishment, not a barn dance. Those boots and that piece of rock around your neck do not fit our aesthetic. I cannot allow you to enter the dining room and disturb the ambiance for our other guests. There is a fast food burger chain about 4 blocks down the avenue. I strongly suggest you take your celebration there. It is much more suited to your current presentation." The words hung in the freezing air like suspended daggers. The humiliation hit Caleb with the force of a runaway freight train. It was visceral, a deep, burning shame that started in his chest and radiated out to his fingertips. He felt the eyes of the bar patrons on his back. He heard the faint whispers, the muffled chuckles of people who had never known what it meant to skip a meal so their wife could have a decent pair of shoes. Caleb, a man who routinely risked his life breaking 2,000-pound animals without a flinch, suddenly felt entirely powerless. He looked down at his boots, the boots his father had worn with such pride, and for the first time in his life, he felt ashamed of them. Sarah squeezed his arm. He looked at her and saw the tears welling up in her beautiful, tired eyes. She was not crying for herself. She was crying because she saw the man she loved more than anything in the world being treated like garbage. She hated this place. She hated the cold marble, the crystal chandeliers, the arrogant man in the tailored suit. "Caleb, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just go. I don't want to be here. I just want to go home." Julian, noticing their hesitation, decided to twist the knife further. He snapped his fingers, raising his hand to signal a burly security guard wearing an earpiece who was standing near the entrance. Charles Julian called out sharply, "Please escort this couple back to their vehicle. They are blocking the reception area and we have important guests arriving shortly." This was the absolute lowest point. Caleb felt a lump in his throat so large it threatened to choke him. He had failed. He had worked his hands to the bone, bled into the Texas dirt, saved every penny, and still he could not give his wife the one thing he had promised her. The money in his pocket meant nothing here. His hard work meant nothing. He was just a dirty cowboy in a room full of kings, and he had no right to pretend otherwise. He swallowed hard, blinking back the burning moisture in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I ruined tonight." He turned his back on the dining room, the heavy scent of truffles and wine mocking his retreat. He took a step toward the heavy oak doors, feeling the weight of the entire world pressing down on his shoulders, ready to walk out into the sweltering Dallas night and disappear back into the dust where they belonged. If you are listening to this right now and you feel your blood boiling at the arrogance of that maitre d', if you know the value of an honest day's work and the profound pain of seeing a good man humiliated for simply being who he is, then pause for a moment and subscribe to this channel. Join our community because you need to hear exactly how the ultimate Texas legend steps out of the shadows to turn this unforgivable injustice upside down. Before Caleb's vintage boots could take another step toward the exit before the heavy oak door could swing open to swallow them back into the night, a voice cut through the lobby. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. It was deep, resonant calm, but carrying the unmistakable heavy weight of a massive storm gathering on the horizon. "I suppose you are going to have to throw me out of this place too, son." The entire lobby froze. The clinking of glasses at the bar stopped abruptly. The whispers died in the throats of the wealthy patrons. Julian, the maitre d', snapped his head toward the source of the voice, his annoyed expression instantly melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. From the shadows of a deep leather booth in the far right corner of the waiting lounge, a figure began to move. He stepped into the golden light of the chandeliers, and every eye in the room locked onto him. He walked slowly with a deliberate, measured pace. Every step of his own custom made cowboy boots echoed against the polished hardwood floor, ringing out like the steady tolling of a bell. He wore a crisp, tailored dark blazer over a perfectly pressed western shirt, but it was the black resistal cowboy hat sitting proudly on his head that commanded absolute authority. Beside him, rising with a serene, effortless elegance, was his wife, Norma, her presence radiating a quiet, undeniable strength. It was George Strait, the king of country music, a man whose net worth and influence could buy and sell this restaurant 10 times over before breakfast, a man who embodied the very soul of Texas. Julian turned the color of ash. His perfectly slicked hair suddenly seemed ridiculous. His Italian suit felt tight and suffocating. He recognized the face immediately. Everyone did. George Strait was not just a celebrity here, he was royalty. Julian stammered, his hands shaking, as he dropped his silver clipboard onto the podium with a loud clatter. "Mr. Strait," he choked out his voice, pitching upwards in fear. "No, of course not, sir. You are a VIP exception. Your style is iconic, sir. We are honored to have you." George did not even look at Julian. He walked right past the podium, ignoring the maitre d' entirely, as if he were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture. George stopped directly in front of Caleb and Sarah. He reached up slowly and tipped the brim of his black resistol hat, a gesture of profound old-school respect. "Good evening, Ma'am." George said, his voice smooth and warm, directed entirely at Sarah. Then he turned to Caleb. He looked at the tears in Caleb's eyes. He looked at the wilted roses, he looked at the turquoise bolo tie, and finally he looked down at the creased ostrich boots. George extended his large, calloused hand, the hand of a man who, despite his millions, still knew how to hold a rope and ride a horse. "I'm George," he said, introducing himself simply, as if his face was not plastered on billboards and platinum records all over the globe. The game had instantly shifted. The authority in the room no longer emanated from the silver clipboard or the European dress code. It was entirely concentrated in the quiet, stoic presence of the cowboy standing between the working-class couple and the doors of rejection. Caleb stared at the outstretched hand of the living legend standing before him, and for a long, agonizing moment, his brain simply could not process the reality of the situation. The freezing air of the lobby seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming rush of heat to his face. He looked at the calloused fingers, the strong, steady grip being offered to him, and he slowly raised his own trembling hand. When their palms met, it was not the limp, practiced handshake of a corporate executive or a politician looking for a vote. It was the firm, unyielding grip of a fellow working man. Caleb felt the rough texture of George's skin, a physical testament to a life that, despite the millions of dollars and the stadiums filled with screaming fans, had never truly left the saddle. That single handshake acted like a lightning rod, grounding the chaotic storm of humiliation and panic that had been raging inside Caleb's chest. George Caleb managed to choke out his voice, barely a raspy whisper, as he desperately tried to swallow the massive lump in his throat. Caleb Hayes. And this here is my wife, Sarah." George held the handshake for a fraction of a second longer than normal, a silent, deliberate transmission of respect and solidarity. He turned his deep, steady gaze towards Sarah, who was still clutching Caleb's arm, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. George offered her a smile that was so incredibly genuine, so completely devoid of any Hollywood pretense, that it instantly brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, Sarah." George said, his voice rumbling with that familiar, comforting Texas drawl that had provided the soundtrack to her entire life. "You look absolutely beautiful this evening. Happy anniversary to you both." The words were simple, but in that suffocating atmosphere of elitist snobbery, they sounded like a profound declaration of war against the establishment. Julian, the maitre d', was practically vibrating with terror. His perfectly manicured hands hovered uselessly over his silver podium, his mind racing as he tried to calculate how to salvage the catastrophic mistake he had just made. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, groveling excuse, but George did not give him the chance. The king of country slowly released Caleb's hand and turned his body to face Julian. The warmth that had just illuminated George's face vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, stoic mask that could have frozen the Rio Grande. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer gravity of his presence commanded the absolute silence of the entire room. Every patron at the bar, every waiter carrying a silver tray, every wealthy socialite dripping in diamonds stopped and listened. "You know, son," George began, his tone polite, but laced with a lethal razor-sharp edge, "I have been sitting over there in the corner watching you for the past 10 minutes. I watched you look this man up and down like he was something you scraped off the bottom of your expensive Italian shoes." Julian swallowed hard, a visible bead of cold sweat tracing its way down his temple. "Mr. Strait, please, you have to understand it is company policy. The aesthetic of the reserve requires a certain standard of presentation to maintain the exclusive atmosphere for our clientele." George took one slow, deliberate step closer to the podium. His dark eyes locked onto Julian's, stripping away every ounce of the younger man's arrogant authority. The aesthetic George repeated the word, tasting like poison in his mouth. "Let me tell you something about the aesthetic of this state. The bolo tie this man is wearing around his neck is more authentic than any piece of fake rustic decoration your corporate bosses hung on these walls to make the tourists feel like they are in the real West. Those boots he is wearing, the ones you just laughed at, have probably walked through more mud and sweat in a single morning than you will experience in a lifetime." The silence in the lobby was absolute deafening. Caleb stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had never had anyone stand up for him like this. In his world, you took the punches, you swallowed your pride, and you kept working. To have a man of George's stature, a man who dined with presidents and royalty, validate his existence in front of the very people who had just tried to erase him, was a feeling so overwhelming it made his knees weak. "This restaurant," George continued, his voice echoing off the marble floors, "was built on the image of the Texas cattleman. It was built on the legacy of men who broke their backs under the sun to build something out of the dirt. And now you want to stand here in your imported suit and tell a man who actually lives that life, who actually bleeds into that dirt, that he is not good enough to eat your food." Julian was trembling now, his eyes darting frantically around the room, hoping for anyone to intervene. But the crowd was captivated entirely firmly on the side of the cowboy. "If the money and the sweat of a hard-working man like Caleb do not serve your aesthetic," George said, delivering the final crushing blow, "then my money and my presence certainly do not belong here either. Norma and I will be leaving, and I will be sure to let every single friend I have in this town know exactly what kind of hospitality the Oak and Iron Reserve is serving these days." The threat was implicit but devastating. A public condemnation from George Strait would be the absolute death knell for the restaurant. Within seconds, the heavy wooden doors of the back office burst open, and the general manager, a short, balding man from New York who had been frantically listening to the commotion over his earpiece, sprinted across the lobby. He was breathless, his face flushed red with sheer panic. Mr. Strait. Mr. Strait, please wait," the manager gasped, practically sliding to a halt in front of the podium. He completely ignored Julian, shoving the maitre d' aside. "I am the general manager. Please accept my most profound and sincere apologies. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding. Julian is new, he does not understand the culture here. Please, I beg of you, do not leave. Your table is ready. The chef has prepared a special menu for you and Mrs. Strait." George looked down at the sweating manager, his expression unreadable. "I am not the one who requires an apology," he said, gesturing with a slight nod of his head toward Caleb and Sarah. The manager spun around, facing the bewildered couple. He bowed slightly, his hands clasped together in a gesture of desperate supplication. "Sir, ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry. Your anniversary should be a night of joy, not this. Please allow me to make this right. Your dinner tonight will be entirely on the house. The finest champagne, the best cuts of beef, whatever you desire." "And Julian," he turned to glare at the pale maitre d', "you are relieved of your duties at the front desk immediately. Go to the back office and wait for me." Julian, looking utterly destroyed, grabbed his silver clipboard and scurried away, disappearing through the swinging kitchen doors without another word. The oppressive gatekeeper had been vanquished, but the emotional damage inflicted on Caleb was not so easily erased. The ranch foreman still stood rigidly, his shoulders tense, the wilting roses drooping in his hand. He appreciated the justice, but the shame of the public spectacle still burned in his chest. He just wanted to take Sarah and hide in the safety of their old truck. George, sensing the lingering humiliation, placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "The manager is offering you a free meal, Caleb," George said softly, his eyes searching the younger man's face. "But I have a better offer. Norma and I are sitting at a quiet table in the back, away from the noise, away from the stairs. We would be absolutely honored if you and your beautiful wife would join us for dinner tonight. Caleb's breath caught. He looked at Sarah, who was weeping openly now, her hands covering her mouth in shock. To be invited to dine with George and Norma Strait was not just a gesture of kindness, it was an act of profound social elevation. It was George pulling them up from the dirt and placing them on a pedestal, proving to every wealthy snob in the room that Caleb and Sarah were the true royalty of Texas. "Sir, we could not possibly impose." Caleb stammered, his pride wrestling with his gratitude. "This is your private evening. You are my guests," George interrupted gently but firmly, leaving no room for argument. "And in Texas, we do not let our guests eat alone. Come on now, the steaks are getting cold." With a gracious smile, Norma Strait stepped forward and gently linked her arm through Sarah's. Norma possessed a quiet, radiant elegance that instantly made Sarah feel safe. "You just ignore the men," honey, Norma whispered softly to Sarah, leading her away from the podium. "They can talk about horses and cattle all night. You and I are going to drink some good wine and celebrate 10 years of putting up with them." The walk through the grand dining room was a surreal, out-of-body experience for Caleb. Only minutes ago he had been ready to retreat into the night, a broken and humiliated man. Now he was walking shoulder to shoulder with a giant. The sea of wealthy patrons parted for them. The whispers that had previously been laced with judgment and disdain were now filled with absolute awe and envy. Caleb kept his head high, his vintage ostrich boots walking with a renewed sense of purpose. He felt the weight of his father's legacy in those boots, and he knew his father would have been proud. The VIP table was secluded in a private alcove, draped in heavy velvet curtains that muffled the ambient noise of the restaurant. It was a sanctuary of warm light and dark leather. As they took their seats, a small army of waiters descended upon them, pouring vintage red wine into crystal glasses and serving platters of roasted bone marrow and warm artisan bread. The stark contrast between the freezing hostile lobby and the warm, intimate embrace of this private table was overwhelming. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was light and polite. George asked Caleb about the ranch he worked on, the types of horses he trained, the condition of the soil after the recent drought. George spoke the language of the land fluently, and for a brief moment Caleb forgot he was talking to a multi-platinum recording artist. He was just talking to another cowboy about the things that mattered. Norma and Sarah bonded instantly, sharing stories about the trials of keeping a household running when the men were out working until sundown. But as the first glasses of wine were emptied and the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, the heavy emotional toll of the evening finally crashed down upon Caleb. He looked across the table at his wife, her face illuminated by the soft candlelight, laughing at something Norma had said. She looked so beautiful, so deserving of the world, and yet all he had managed to give her was a public humiliation. Caleb stared down at his rough, scarred hands, resting on the pristine white tablecloth. The thick dam of stoic silence that he had built around his emotions his entire life suddenly cracked. The pain of a provider who felt he had failed his ultimate duty was too much to bear. Mr. Strait, Caleb began, his voice thick and wavering instantly, silencing the light chatter at the table. "I do not know how to thank you for what you did out there. But the truth is, I never should have brought her here." George set his wineglass down, his expression shifting to one of deep, serious empathy. "Why do you say that, Caleb?" "Because I do not belong here." Caleb confessed, a single hot tear escaping his eye and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He did not bother to wipe it away. "We saved for a whole year. Every tip Sarah made at the diner, every extra hour I worked breaking colts in the blistering heat. We kept it in a glass jar on the kitchen table. I just wanted to give her one night where she felt like a queen, one night where we did not have to worry about the electric bill or the truck breaking down. But when that man looked at me, when he looked at my boots and told me to go to a fast food joint, I felt like I was nothing. I felt like a failure. A man is supposed to provide for his wife, and I could not even get her through the front door." Sarah reached across the table and grabbed Caleb's hand, squeezing it with all her might. "Caleb, please do not say that," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I do not care about this restaurant. I care about you." But Caleb could not be consoled. The shame was too deeply rooted in his bones. "It is the truth, Sarah," he whispered, staring at his plate. Love does not pay the rent. Love does not buy you the dress you deserve. I am just a dirt-poor cowboy, and tonight I proved it to the whole world." The silence that fell over the table was heavy, thick with raw, unfiltered agony. It was the universal pain of the working class, the agonizing realization that no matter how hard you work, the world is rigged to make you feel small. Norma Strait looked at Caleb, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She recognized that pain. She had seen it before a lifetime ago, in the eyes of the man sitting next to her. She turned her head slowly and looked at George. They did not need to speak. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of shared history communicated everything in a single profound glance. George gave her a barely perceptible nod, a silent agreement that it was time to open a door to their past that they rarely ever opened for anyone. George leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, clasping his hands together. The dim candlelight caught the silver buckle of his belt and the deep lines of wisdom etched around his eyes. Caleb George said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register, a tone that commanded absolute attention. "You look around this room and you see the chandeliers, the expensive wine, the tailored suits. You see the illusion of success. And you think that because you have dirt under your fingernails and empty pockets, you have failed your wife." Caleb swallowed hard, unable to meet George's eyes. "Yes, sir, I do." George let out a long, slow breath, shaking his head slowly. "Let me tell you a story, son. A story about a dirt-poor cowboy who felt exactly the way you do right now. And let me tell you about the night he thought he had ruined his own marriage before it even really began." George reached out and gently took Norma's hand, his thumb tracing the gold band on her finger. It was 1971. I was just a kid fresh out of high school, absolutely terrified of the world, and completely head over heels in love with this beautiful woman sitting next to me. We did not have a dime to our names. My family did not have money. We were just scraping by, trying to figure out how to survive. But I knew one thing for absolute certain. I knew I could not live another day without making her my wife. Sarah leaned in, completely captivated by the raw vulnerability in the voice of the legendary singer. We knew we could not afford a real wedding. George continued, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, seeing the ghosts of his past. No white dress, no church filled with flowers, no fancy reception. So we did the only thing we could do. We eloped. We drove down to Mexico, just the two of us, to a tiny, dusty town across the border. We found a small chapel, and we said our vows. It was the happiest moment of my life. But the reality of our poverty was waiting for us the second we stepped out of that church. Norma smiled softly, a bittersweet memory playing on her lips. We had exactly enough money for a tank of gas, and one night in a cheap motel on the way back to Texas, she added her voice, gentle and melodic. That was supposed to be our grand honeymoon. We were driving back up through the desert, George said, the intensity in his voice rising. The sun was beating down, just like it does in the dead of summer. The truck I was driving was an absolute piece of junk, holding together by rust and prayers. And right in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, the radiator blew, steam hissing everywhere, the engine completely dead. We were stranded. Caleb watched George's face, seeing the phantom frustration of that young boy from decades ago. "I spent 4 hours under the hood of that boiling truck," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I burned my hands. I was covered head to toe in black grease oil and desert dust. I managed to patch the hose with some tape and wire, just enough to limp the truck into the next town. By the time we pulled into the parking lot of the only motel on the highway, it was past midnight. We were exhausted, starving, and I looked like I had just crawled out of a coal mine." George paused, taking a slow sip of his water, the memory clearly still carrying a heavy emotional weight. "I walked into that motel lobby, leaving Norma in the truck. I walked up to the front desk, pulled out the few crumpled dollar bills I had left, and asked for a room. The owner of the place, a mean, bitter old man, took one look at my grease-stained clothes, my dirty boots, and the pitiful amount of money in my hand. He looked at me with the exact same disgust that Julian looked at you tonight, Caleb. The connection was made. The invisible thread between the global superstar and the humble ranch foreman was pulled tight, binding them in a shared brotherhood of struggle. He told me we did not belong there." George whispered, the pain of the memory echoing in the private alcove. "He called me a filthy vagabond. He told me to take my trashy truck and get off his property before he called the police. He slid my crumpled dollars back across the counter and turned his back on me. George looked directly into Caleb's eyes, his gaze piercing right through to the young man's soul. I walked out of that lobby. Caleb and I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. It was my wedding night. I was supposed to be a man. I was supposed to be a husband, protecting and providing for my bride. And instead I was standing in the freezing desert wind, covered in dirt, having just been thrown out of a $10 a night roach-infested motel. Caleb felt a tear slip down his face, completely paralyzed by the story. "What did you do?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. "I walked back to the truck," George said, his voice cracking slightly. "I leaned against the rusted fender, I slid down to the dirt, and I put my head in my hands, and I cried. I cried like a baby. I felt like the biggest failure on the face of the earth. I thought to myself, what kind of life am I offering this woman? She deserves a mansion, and I cannot even give her a clean bed to sleep in. I was ready to tell her to leave me, to find a man who could actually give her the world. The private dining room was dead silent. The waiters had stopped moving, the ambient jazz music seemed to fade into nothingness. There was only the raw, bleeding truth of a man who had conquered the world, admitting that he had once been entirely broken by it. Norma shifted in her chair. She reached out and placed her hand over Caleb's rough knuckles, her touch as comforting as a mother's embrace. She looked at Sarah and then at Caleb, her eyes shining with a fierce, unyielding love. "Do you want to know what happened next?" Caleb, Norma asked, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Do you want to know the secret that kept us together for 50 years after that night?" Caleb nodded slowly, unable to speak, the anticipation suffocating him. Norma kept her hand over Caleb's rough knuckles, her touch radiating a maternal warmth that seemed to thaw the icy shame lingering in his bones. She looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a fierce, unyielding love, a love that had weathered storms far worse than a broken-down truck or a snobbish maitre d'. "Do you want to know what happened next?" Caleb, Norma asked, her voice ringing with absolute clarity, cutting through the heavy emotional silence of the private alcove. "Do you want to know the secret that kept us together for 50 years after that night?" Caleb nodded slowly, the anticipation suffocating him. He felt as though the entire trajectory of his life, his marriage, his worth as a man was hanging on her next words. "I watched him walk out of that brightly lit lobby," Norma said, her voice softening as she recalled the memory. "I was sitting in the passenger seat of that beat-up truck, shivering in the desert cold, wearing the only nice dress I owned. I saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way he dragged his boots across the gravel, and when he slid down against the fender and put his head in his hands, I knew exactly what had happened. I knew he felt like he had failed me." She turned her gaze to George, a look of profound adoration passing between them. "I opened the door of the truck, and I stepped out into the dirt." Norma continued, "I did not care about the grease on his clothes. I did not care that we had no money and nowhere to sleep. I walked over to him, I knelt down in the dust right beside him, and I took his face in my hands. I looked him dead in the eyes, and I told him the only thing that mattered." Norma squeezed Caleb's hand, her voice steady and powerful. "I told him, George Strait, I did not marry you for a fancy hotel room. I did not marry you for a perfect truck or a pocket full of money. I married you because you are the man I want to be stranded in the desert with. I married you because when the whole world shuts its doors on us, I know you will still be holding my hand." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a half-century of unbroken promises. Caleb felt a massive shudder run through his body. The dam he had built around his emotions finally shattered completely. The tears he had been fighting so hard to hold back flowed freely down his weathered cheeks. He looked across the table at Sarah and saw his own profound revelation reflected in her eyes. "The secret of a 50-year marriage," Caleb, Norma said softly, her voice a gentle balm to his wounded pride, "is not about the luxurious places that let you in. It is not about the steak you eat or the clothes you wear. The secret is built on the sidewalk when the door slams in your face. It is built in the dirt when your truck breaks down and you have nothing left but each other. The secret is looking at your partner and deciding that as long as you are together, you already have the entire castle." George leaned back in his chair, his eyes shining with a quiet, intense pride. That night in the desert, George added, his voice rumbling with a deep, resonant truth. "We slept in the cab of that freezing truck. We huddled together, under a single thin blanket, shivering until the sun came up. And it was the best night of my life, because I knew right then and there that I had a woman who would stand by me when I had absolutely nothing. That is the kind of love that builds an empire, son. Not the kind that can be bought with a reservation at a fancy restaurant. Caleb stared at his hands, the hands that had worked the earth, the hands that had built fences and broken horses, the hands that had held Sarah through every hardship. He realized in that profound moment that his hands were not a symbol of his failure. They were the very foundation of his success. They were the proof that he was a man who fought for what he loved. He looked up at George and Norma, the shame completely evaporating from his chest, replaced by a sudden overwhelming surge of pride. He felt 10 feet tall. He felt like the richest man in the state of Texas. "Thank you, Caleb," whispered his voice, thick but steady. "Thank you for telling me that. I think I really needed to hear it." George smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "You did not need to hear it from me, Caleb. You just needed to remember it. You look at your wife. You look at the way she looked at you when that fool in the lobby tried to tear you down. She was ready to walk out of here and eat a fast food burger with you just to get you away from that disrespect. That is a queen's son, and you are a king for earning that kind of loyalty." The heavy emotional atmosphere of the table began to lift, replaced by a profound sense of camaraderie and joy. The general manager of the restaurant, returning with a bottle of the most expensive champagne in the cellar, personally poured their glasses, his hands shaking slightly, as he tried to remain unobtrusive. He presented a platter of the finest cuts of Wagyu beef, apologizing profusely once again, before retreating quickly to leave them in peace. The rest of the evening was magic, pure, unadulterated magic. They ate, they laughed, they shared stories of the Texas hill country, the unpredictable nature of wild horses, and the simple, profound beauty of a life lived close to the land. George and Caleb talked about the changing seasons, the smell of the first rain hitting the dry dust, the satisfaction of a hard day's work completed. Norma and Sarah talked about the quiet strength required to be the backbone of a family, the recipes passed down through generations, the way a simple touch can fix a broken day. For 3 hours, Caleb and Sarah were not just a ranch foreman and a diner waitress. They were the honored guests of royalty, treated with a level of respect and dignity that money could never buy. They were seen not for the clothes they wore or the balance in their bank account, but for the content of their character and the depth of their love. When the dinner finally came to an end, George insisted on paying the tip for the entire table, leaving a stack of $100 bills that made the waiter gasp in shock. George stood up, towering over the table, and reached for his black resistal hat. He placed it carefully on his head, adjusting the brim with a practiced motion. "It has been an absolute pleasure," Caleb George said, extending his hand once again. This time, Caleb met his grip firmly, his eyes clear and full of gratitude. "Happy anniversary to you both. And remember, the next time someone tries to tell you that you do not belong, you just look down at those boots and remember exactly who you are." Norma hugged Sarah tightly, whispering a final word of encouragement in her ear before taking George's arm. The couple walked out of the private alcove, their presence commanding the same absolute reverence as when they had arrived. The entire restaurant watched them leave, the whispers of awe following them, out the heavy oak doors and into the warm Dallas night. Caleb and Sarah stood alone in the private dining room, the remnants of the incredible feast scattered across the table. Caleb turned to his wife, taking both of her hands in his. He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had seen him at his lowest and had never once wavered in their devotion. "I love you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you more than life itself, and I promise you I will spend the rest of my days making sure you know that." Sarah smiled, tears welling up in her eyes once again, but this time they were tears of absolute joy. "I know you will, Caleb. I always knew." They walked out of the restaurant hand in hand, their heads held high. The freezing air conditioning of the lobby gave way to the thick, sweltering heat of the Texas night. The valet brought their dusty, rattling pickup truck to the front entrance. Caleb tipped the man, generously opened the passenger door for Sarah, and climbed into the driver's seat. As he turned the key, the engine roared to life, a familiar, comforting sound that felt like home. 10 years later, the sun sets over a sprawling piece of land in the Texas Hill Country, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold. The air smells of sweet grass and incoming rain. On the wide wooden porch of a beautiful newly built farmhouse, Caleb and Sarah sit side by side in a pair of rocking chairs. Caleb is older now, his face lined with the comfortable weathering of a man who has finally built his own kingdom. He is no longer a foreman. He is the owner of this ranch, the master of his own destiny. Sarah sits beside him, her hair slightly graying, but her beauty as radiant as ever. They are celebrating their 20th anniversary. There is no fancy restaurant, no imported crystal chandeliers, no arrogant maitre d' to tell them what to wear. There is only the quiet hum of the crickets, the gentle rustle of the wind through the oak trees, and the deep, profound peace of a life well lived. Inside the house, hanging prominently above the stone fireplace in the living room, is a framed photograph. It is a picture taken 10 years ago in a dimly lit private alcove of a Dallas steakhouse. In the photo, Caleb and Sarah are smiling brightly, flanking George and Norma Strait. Caleb is wearing his vintage ostrich boots and his turquoise bolo tie, standing tall and proud next to the king of country. Caleb reaches out and takes Sarah's hand, his rough, calloused fingers intertwining with hers. He looks out over his land at the horses grazing in the distance, at the life they built from the dirt up. He remembers the crushing humiliation of that night 10 years ago, and he remembers the profound grace of the man who reached down and pulled him out of the darkness. He squeezes Sarah's hand, feeling the solid, unbreakable bond that has carried them through 2 decades of storms and sunshine. He knows now with absolute certainty that the true measure of a man is not found in the places that open their doors to him, but in the strength he finds when those doors are slammed shut. He knows that true class cannot be bought or worn. It must be lived through humility, character, and the courage to stand by the ones you love. And as the last rays of the Texas sun dip below the horizon, Caleb Hayes knows that he is the richest man in the world.